plugged fuel lines, plugged filters, premature injection system failures don't have to cause downtime. These problems can now be a thing of the past. Fuel doesn't have to be a four-letter word. When a diesel fuel filter clogs, it is simply doing its job, keeping particles over a certain size from entering the fuel system and harming the injection system. In addition to solid particles, filters can be clogged by water, bacteria, and wax. Wax or paraffin is an important part of diesel fuel's chemistry. It is the prime ingredient for the lubrication and energy content of diesel fuel. And it is interesting to note that the amount of paraffin in a load of fuel can vary by the season and the fuel's crude stock source. During the summer months, or in warmer climates, a high paraffin content is desirable for its energy and lubricating qualities. Due to the overall decline in crude oil quality, many refineries, even in cooler climates, are adding extra paraffin to diesel fuel in an effort to raise its cetane rating. However, at around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, the paraffin in diesel fuel begins to crystallize. This is known as the cloud point. As the temperature goes below the cloud point, paraffin crystals cling together to form larger crystals. These crystals clog filters and stop fuel flow. The pour point is 10 to 15 degrees below the cloud point. This is the point at which diesel fuel becomes a semi-solid. However, this fuel can still be pumped through fuel lines. Although this semi-solid paraffin will completely clog filters, paraffin is a desirable part of diesel fuel as long as it stays in a liquid state. Water can also cause filter clogging. Ice crystals, which form at temperatures below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, are the principal cause of filter clogging by water. But unlike paraffin, water is a problem in whatever form it may be, vapor, liquid, or solid. Water gets into the fuel through the distribution system. Refinery storage tanks, pipelines, distributors' tanks, transport barges and trucks, and at pumping stations, underground storage tanks. Moreover, condensation occurs constantly because the air around us is filled with moisture. A chamber such as the vehicle's fuel tank, with an airspace that undergoes a change in temperature, is a perfect place to condense water. That is why it is recommended to top off tanks before letting a vehicle sit overnight. Water in any form is a principal cause of injection system failure. Corroded or scored pumps and injector tips often result from water-contaminated fuel. Water also leads to other types of filter clogging. Water is the prime cause and method of transport for rust, scale, dirt, and bacteria. Bacteria generally live in the water and feed on the hydrocarbons in the fuel. There are more than 100 types of microorganisms that form slime, acids, and debris in fuel systems. As a solid, they clog a portion of the filter. Once there, bacteria can quickly wick up a filter's outer side, clogging it entirely. Bacterial growth also forms strong corrosive byproducts that can also damage fuel system components. High sulfur fuels can cause injector system problems. Sulfur, combined with water, results in sulfuric acid, which corrodes the injection parts. Particulates, if not stopped by the filter, can damage the injection pump and injectors. Over the years, there have been many attempts to solve diesel fuel-related problems. Perhaps the easiest but least effective of these has been fuel additives. There are basically three types of additives: water dispersants, paraffin limiters, and flow improvers. A water dispersant is usually alcohol-based. Alcohol will absorb water, but only a limited percentage. It can transport water downstream to parts that won't tolerate water. Alcohol is also corrosive and actually speeds paraffin crystallization. Although paraffin limiters attempt to reduce the cloud point, it is not possible to lower the cloud point with an additive. The only realistic method is to thin the fuel with a solvent, such as number 1 fuel oil or kerosene. Gasoline should never be used. It makes a dangerously flammable mixture, is corrosive, and makes starting more difficult. Flow improvers, referred to as depressants, lower a fuel's pour point, but have no effect on its cloud point. They allow the fuel to flow out of the tank, but paraffin crystals will still clog the filter. In order to get waxed fuel through a filter, the paraffin must be melted. Fuel heaters were developed for this purpose. When evaluating fuel heaters, it is important to remember heat travels to the coldest point and flows upward or rises. And consider this. If we look at a candle, we see its wax melts very slowly because the heat from the flame rises into the air away from the wax. When the candle is turned upside down, we see that the wax melts very quickly. This indicates that the logical way to put heat into a filter is from the bottom up. A waxed filter is still perfectly good if you can melt enough wax to allow sufficient fuel flow to maintain combustion. Today, engine coolant is a popular heat source for most fuel heaters. Typically, a coiled line or multiple tubes of fuel pass through a body of warmed coolant. However, the fuel runs at a velocity up to 45 inches per second, sort of like passing a finger through a candle flame. Also, much of the coolant's heat is lost to the atmosphere as the coolant attempts to heat the outer shell. Electrical heaters, such as a wrapped line or inserted line, suffer similar problems because of the amount of amperage needed to raise the fuel's temperature. Usually, electric heat can only be effective on low fuel flow engines. Chemical reactions in fuel heaters can also cause suspended water to form into droplets which separate from the fuel. Water separators were developed to remove water. Most fuel water filters, like common air-water separators, use a settlement chamber in conjunction with a filter that is designed to repel, strip, or coalesce water from diesel fuel. When sufficiently cooled, water in the form of ice crystals mixes and flows with the fuel, but clogs filters. To remove ice from fuel, it must be melted, and any water which does collect may freeze in water separators and prevent draining until the units are thawed. In short, additives, fuel heaters, and water separators each address only one part of the problem and can frequently cause problems in another part of the system. A fuel processing onboard mini refinery that filters and heats fuel and separates water all in one unit is the best answer for making a diesel engine run on number 2 fuel oil, no matter what the conditions. This fuel processor is typical of the units manufactured by Davco. In this unit, fuel enters a residence chamber where heating and water separation occur. The inlet port is at the middle of the unit, which allows cold fuel to move downward, pushing the warmed fuel upward. As the fuel enters the open chamber, its velocity is decreased. The curvature of the wall is followed by the fuel flow to create a proper centrifugal action. These various motions and paths force the water to settle out and collect in the bottom of the unit where it can be drained. This water will not freeze in the fuel processor during operation. Heat is introduced through an element totally surrounded by the fuel. The source of heat can be any warm fluid, or it can be electrically heated when sufficient amperage is available. The slowed path of the fuel through the unit allows sufficient time for heat transfer. As the fuel rises through the unit, most of the available heat is picked up by the fuel with little loss to the atmosphere. At ambient temperatures below the fuel's cloud point, a layer of wax may form on the inner wall of the fuel chamber. This actually helps insulate the fuel against further heat losses and improves the thermal efficiency of the unit. As the warm, dewatered fuel moves to the top of the unit, it flows to the filter. This filter, intended in Davco units to be the engine's only fuel filter, is as close to the heat source as possible to provide the maximum amount of potential heat. This lowers the possibility of paraffin clogging. With the filter mounted above the heating and water separation chamber, most particles and water droplets that were stopped by the filter fall back down into the lower chamber, where they may be drained away. As many functions as possible should be integrated into one unit to be as efficient as possible and to conserve time, space, and money. If the fuel is kept warm, water-free, and clean, it will flow through the lines, the filter, and the injectors to the engine, where it can perform its prime function, provide power. Fuel line clogging, which is frequently diagnosed as a clogged filter, is most often caused by poor fuel line routing. Every fitting is a place of restriction and source of heat loss. At 90-degree fittings, especially the one at the fuel tank, ice can form and jam at the elbow, causing restriction and fuel starvation. This also happens at low points in the fuel system where water gathers. A most likely place for clogging to occur is at the 90-degree fitting on top of the fuel tank. A very effective method of keeping this elbow clear is to heat the elbow with warmed fuel. The warm fuel is fed into an insulated elbow. This mixes with fuel drawn from the fuel tank. The warmed fuel provides enough heat to prevent clogging. This can be accomplished by using warmed fuel from the fuel heater. On some engines, like Caterpillar's, return fuel may be used. An alternative method uses an electrically heated elbow to warm fuel. Fuel, when handled in a proper manner, doesn't have to cause problems. Today's technology has proven that plugged fuel lines, plugged filters, premature injection system failures don't have to cause downtime. These problems can now be a thing of the past. Fuel doesn't have to be a four-letter word.